And it's a very upmarket whiskey and cigar bar, and that is named Ralph Louis Frederick. The Christian names of his maternal grandfather. Ralph Hains was a member of this family for many years, and his son is a member today, and he is here. Marcus has had a keen interest in whisky for many years. He has visited whisky distilleries throughout the world and gained a great deal of knowledge about the product and its history. To give us some thoughts and some history of whisky, please welcome Marcus.
Well, it's fantastic being in front of you today to share something that I'm very passionate about, and that is whisky. And there are some coming out the table, and I just ask you to hold off on drinking it just yet. We will get to that. But I'd like to guide you in exactly how to drink, smell, and taste whisky properly. So while they're being delivered, let me just delve into the great history that is whisky. And if we're talking about the history of whisky, we really need to go back to the history of distillation. And the history of distillation all began down by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down. Hey. But really, that was part of Mesopotamia. And that is where the art of distillation was learned and created. And that information travelled up the information superhighway of the day, super quick. It was the Silk Road. And it was obviously very slow, but it travelled as far east as China and as far west as Ireland. So, how do you create alcohol? Now, alcohol, when we're creating an alcohol, we're starting with a carbohydrate. And if you're in the Caribbean, that'll probably be sugar cane. If you're in France, it's likely to be a grape, and you're making a brandy or a cognac. And if you're in somewhere like Ireland, you're taking a barley. Now, that could be malted or unmalted to be able to make a sugary-based liquid. And when we make that sugary-based liquid, we tip in some yeast. And what does the yeast do? It eats the sugar and gives off CO2 and alcohol. And by the end of that, you have something like a rudimentary beer, and about that percentage, about 5 to 8%. Of course, when we're talking about a spirit, we want to strengthen that. So we want to distill that spirit. And what is distillation? Distillation is actually separating out the alcohol from that watery substrate. Now, at sea level, we all know that water boils at 100 degrees. Alcohol boils at 78. So if we take that liquid and we heat that up to around about 78 degrees, the alcohol is going to vaporize much faster than the water. And if we can separate that vapor and then cool it down and condense it back into a liquid, we've got something which is stronger. And that is the basics of distillation. Now, how to make whiskey, because whiskey is what we're here to talk about today. It's 3 ingredients and 3 processes. It is water, barley, and yeast. And the processes are fermentation, distillation, and maturation. So we talked about before, we have our barley. Now in Scotland we have these things called single malts. So what's a single malt? Well, single malt isn't one word, it's actually 2 words. Single means single distillery. It can only come from one distillery. And malt means 100% malted barley. Now, what is malting? Malting is where we're taking that barley and we're wetting it. We're tricking it into germination. Through the process of germination, we're converting the starches in that seed into sugars because we want those sugars to then ferment. That then is gristed up, well, it's first of all dried out, and in Scotland they're going to dry out with kilns and fires. Now those fires may be with wood or with coal or with peat. Now, peat is a decaying vegetable matter that you dig out of the ground. It's wet, nothing grows in it. But if you leave it outside for 12 months under cover, it dries out and burns really well. Now, throughout Scotland and Ireland, they'll utilise that to actually heat their houses, to cook with, all sorts. One aspect of burning peat, though, is it gives off a whole lot of smoke. And that smoke, when you're drying out your grain, will actually attach to that grain. And even when you grist it up, and put it through the process of fermentation, distillation, you're still going to get that smokiness come through. So I don't know about you, but some people love their smoky peated whiskey. I personally, I do not. And that's okay. Now, if we go back to 13th century Ireland, you've got a whole bunch of monks, because the people who actually transported this information distillation were mostly men of the cloth. Because back in the days around Mesopotamia, they learnt the art of distillation and they created medicines. And that was what the first alcohols were made for, was medicines. So if you ever get home one night, a little bit terpsed, and your better half is giving you a hell of a time, just say you weren't drinking, you were self-medicating. Now this information, back in Ireland, you've got a bunch of monks in a big house, no women. They might have taken a vow of silence. Life would have been pretty boring, but they learned the art of distillation and they got drunk. And we're very glad they got drunk and they enjoyed getting drunk because they learned a lot of things along the way. One, a still should be made out of copper because it strips out certain sulfites and those are some bad flavour compounds. Also, the first part of coming off the still, you do not want to drink. That's methanol. That can literally send you blind, or it's even killed people in Indonesia recently. So you don't want that first bit. And this is where the term blind drunk actually came from. And it's not that your sight actually returned, no, you were now blind for life. So that first part coming off the still, you do not want to drink. They also learned the last part coming off the still, you also didn't want to drink. It just had a bad smell, not a great taste, and could give you a bit of a headache. So you just want to take the hearts. And they took those hearts, and then the next thing to do is to mature it. Understand that all whiskey, brandy, any of those dark spirits coming off the still come completely clear. They look exactly like vodka. It's through the maturation that they get 100% of the colour and about 80% of the flavour. Now in Scotland and Ireland, you have to age in oak, 100% oak. It can be European oak, it could be French oak, it could be American oak. It could have had bourbon before, it could have had sherry before, it could have wine, anything, but it must be oak. And so that's going to be also part of the reason they get so much flavour. So in a very rudimentary sense, drinking Scotch whisky and other whiskies is a bit like tasting trees. Now, 1495, the first time whisky ever appears written in the written word, and it's in the Exchequer rolls. And then there's a very famous monk called Brother John Core. So Brother John Core got a letter, and he got a letter from a bloke, and it said, I'm sending you 8 bowls of barley. I want you to make me aquavitae. Now, what does aquavitae mean? Well, it means water of life, as does eau de vie. And even when we look at the etymology of the word whiskey, it comes from the Gaelic ishkabaha, which means water of life. Again, these were all medicines. We are just self-medicating after all. Now, has everyone got a whiskey? Excellent. Because I could do with a drink. So, when we're tasting whiskey and smelling whiskey, it's really important to do a certain way. Most people like a wine, they're going to give it a good swirl in the glass. They're going to stick their nose in, take a big sniff, and that's going to be a bit like a COVID test. This is 40% alcohol. It's not a wine which is sitting at 12 to 14%. That's not going to be so enjoyable. So instead, you actually don't need to swirl it because it's got a whole lot of active parts in it. It's got to have a great smell anyway. We're drinking out of actually some lovely whiskey glasses. These are a spirit glass. I know a lot of people think that is a whiskey glass. Now, where'd that come from? Well, that came from when Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt got together to try to see the end of World War II. Now, Churchill, being the booze hound that he is, had a bowl of single malt whiskey with him. But they didn't have any glasses. But Stalin had his men get their vodka glasses out of his bag. That's a vodka glass. Vodka is a spirit of negligible odour, colour and taste. You can't smell much or taste much in these things. They're great if you want to put a whiskey on ice, or they're great for a whiskey sour, but other than that, they're great for water. So, going back to smelling whiskey, the best way to do this is to put your nose over the glass, but breathe through your mouth. Everyone can pick their whiskey up and try this. I know it's a little bit like aerobics or something, but over your nose, breathe through your mouth. You're still pulling some of that scent over your olfactory senses, and you get more of the lighter floral notes within that whiskey without burning your olfactory senses, and it makes it much more enjoyable. Now, I'm going to ask you to take a very small sip to begin with, and while I continue to talk, I want you to hold that in your mouth. Just a small sip. And I want you to hold it there for 30 seconds. Now, this is going to burn a little bit. It's going to tingle. It's going to be a little bit peppery. That's okay. That's the alcohol talking. But what we're doing right now is we're acclimatising your mouth to the taste of it. And it's going, you're going to salivate. And after a while, now if you swallow that down, I want you to take another sip of your whiskey. And now this sip of whiskey, you'll actually be able to taste much better. It's not going to prickle or burn as much, and you get much more joy out of it. My dad says I'm right. What a surprise. So now this letter that Brother John Core got from this bloke to make him aqua vitae, it wasn't just any bloke, it was actually the King James IV of Scotland had sent this down. So obviously, if this is good enough for the king, it's good enough for everyone. And whiskey production and whiskey drinking became very popular. Now, it wasn't until 1664, and by now, the bloody English had control of Scotland. There was a lot of unlicensed Scottish whiskey production, and people were making money out of it. So what do you reckon the English wanted? They wanted their 2 cents or more. They wanted to tax it. Well, the Scots, being such fond, friends of the English, thought, well, this sounded great. So they disappeared. They fled into the Highlands, they fled to the islands, they went as far away as they could to keep on continuing making their illicit whiskey production. The ones that were local in the lowlands didn't have any choice but to pay these really exorbitant taxes. Even 10 years later, Highland whiskey was still making up 50% of the sales of all the whiskey in Scotland. So it really wasn't doing very much. And the illicit production of whiskey continued on. Now, it was great to be able to go up to the Highlands because, you're in these glens. Now, glen in Scotland means valley. That is why there's so many whiskies that start with glen, because they're in a valley, and that's where they would have initially started. What's great about a valley is you can see the taxman coming over the hill from a long way away, so you can pack up and move on again. So it was a really great place to be. They would be distilling at night so that you couldn't see the smoke or the steam rising from their stills, and they could pack up and move it on the next day. So that continued on, and it was for 160 years this continued. And then they finally decided to change the excise tax, which is quite similar to what we have today. And they put just a £10 tax on the distillery, and they charged them per barrel of whiskey they made. And within 10 years, just about all the whiskey distilleries became legal. Now, often you'll see on a whiskey bottle, the label, they'll have an age on there. That's really, everyone thinks, oh, that's the year they actually first started whiskey production. No, that's the year they became legal. They were doing whiskey well before that. Now, we're just going to jump back to Ireland quickly. So in 1831, there was a guy named Hains Co. Now, he's an Irish tax collector. He's going around to all these distilleries to sort of see and make sure that he's getting their $2 worth. Now, in Ireland, they distill 3 times, while in Scotland, they only distill twice. So the rule in Ireland is 3 times. Why do they distill in Ireland 3 times? To be sure. But what he did is he saw this process and he thought, well, I'm just going to turn this on its head. And that's literally what he did. He created the Hains coffee still, of course naming it after himself. It's also known as the column still or the continuous still. And it was absolutely brilliant at separating alcohol from water and way more efficient. Now, he tried to sell this wonderful idea to the Irish. They had a couple of words for him. None of them were yes, thank you. I think one of them might have finished with off. So he didn't do too well there. So he took it over to the Scots, and the Scots thought, well, this is brilliant. We could definitely use this. This could save us a lot of time and effort and energy. Not only did the Scots think, well, yes, we'll use column stills, but because of the saving in time, let's not malt the grain, because that's a whole process itself, wetting it, drying it out again, which takes a huge amount of time. It's normally over these enormous floors with these guys with big spades turning it over up and down the rows all day. In fact, these guys, if you've seen them, were a bit like this, and that was called monkey shoulder. So the guys would turn the grain, and there's a whiskey named that today. So I thought, if we can save that and just take barley and grist up, it's still got some sugar in it, and run it through a column still, we can do it that way. Now, column distillation makes a much lighter, easier drinking spirit. And at this time then, this is when blends became king. Now I think at this stage it would be good to tell you, well, what's the difference between a single malt and a blended whiskey? We talked about a single malt being a single distillery, 100% malted grain. A blended whiskey is single malts from multiple distilleries, but also grain whiskey in it as well. When we can also have a blended malt, and in fact, today's whiskey that I've poured for you is a blended malt. This is Naked Grouse. It's actually a mixture of Highland Park, Macallan, and Glenrothes. It's quite a sherried whiskey, so you get those lovely fruitcake flavours, a little bit of spice from the European oak and things as well. But very easy drink. Only sitting at 40%. I think whiskies are great when they're sort of cask strength, but that's right. Now, blends became king. Around about this time as well, you had a young lad named John, whose father passed away, and he was only the age of 15. Lucky enough, there was a reasonable inheritance, and he could start himself a corner store. So opened this corner store, and in corner stores back in those days, they also sold whiskey. But often with these whiskies, they'll be getting these single malts in, and they'll be delicious, and their customers say, oh, this is fantastic, and they bring their growler and take that home and drink that whiskey, and the next time they come back, it's not as nice, it's a different single malt. So what John did is he decided to actually start blending, and he used some of the grain and the single malts to be able to make it. And he became quite famous for it. In fact, when he passed on the business to his son, Alexander, it made up 8% of their sales, which is quite a large amount back at the time. But the true person who was fantastic at this was his son. His son had actually been working as a tea blender previously and really put his nose to the grindstone and blending fantastic whiskey. By the time he passed this business on to his children, it made up 95 to 98% of their sales. Now, any idea what his father's last name was? Indeed. That was Johnny Walker. Now, his son not only was a great blender, but he was a great marketer, and he was a great thoughtful person. He made the bottle square. Why would we make the bottle square? We can fit more in a box. Well, boxes in a crate, or crates in a pallet, etc. We can ship it. The other reason is when they're clinking together in the back of a cart, horse and cart going somewhere over these cobblestones, they're much stronger because they've got a much flatter, stronger side rather than round bottles. They're clinking just on one point and are much more likely to break. He also put a diagonal label on it. Now, it doesn't matter if this is across the other side of the room, you guys are all going to recognise it as Johnny Walker. But the reason he put the diagonal label on, because he could then write in bigger writing across the front of the bottle and have bigger text. So very, very clever. So, but even though blends became king, Irish whiskey was by far and wide the most popular whiskey at the time. So much so that the Scots, who are now making all these blended whiskies, which the Irish were very unhappy about because they're like, that's not how you make whiskey. You must put it in a pot still. In fact, we're so upset with the way that you're making whiskey, we're going to spell whiskey differently. And they put an E in the word whiskey, and the E stands for excellence. They really did put their finger up towards the Scots, I'm sure. So not only that, the Scots were failing against the Irish in terms of their sales. The Irish, again, being triple distilled, is a much lighter and more enjoyable spirit to drink. So the Scots started writing on their bottles, Irish whiskey, much to the chagrin of the Irish. Now, where are we with time? We're okay, excellent. So we've talked about the Irish and the Scottish and the changes there. We've talked about the types of grain that we can use, but we're just talking about one segment really of the whiskey market. If we want to go on from there, we've got American whiskey. Now, American whiskey is quite different from the whiskey in our glasses because, we know bourbon and we know rye. Now, bourbon is made with a percentage of, it's got to be minimum 51% corn, and rye has got to be minimum 51% rye grain. Now, why was it they were utilising corn? Well, it all started in 1776. There was a Corn Patch and Cabin Rights Act that was released, and this is when, if you were an immigrant, you were able to get some free land. And the land was about half the size of the CBD of Adelaide. So it's quite a large tract of land. Now, there was 2 rules that you got that land free. And that was if you were able to grow a certain amount of corn, and it wasn't that much, and you had to be able to build a log cabin inside of 2 years. So you had all these immigrants going over there. They're all planting corn and growing corn. They get their cabins in, but they go to sell their corn. Everyone's got corn. No one's really interested in buying it, but they're immigrants, and they know how to distill. So then they started distilling their corn, and they made what was rudimentarily bourbon at the time. Now, they were back in the days, casks were really, people would use them like boxes. They didn't have cardboard boxes back then, but they did have casks. And you might get a barrel and it's got salted fish in it or something like that. Now, if they want to put their bourbon into that cask, or their white dog back in the day as it was, you really want to make sure that there's not that smell of salty fish in there anymore. That's not going to be very nice. So what they did is they burned the casks and they char them down to it, and that's called a level 5 alligator char that they use, which opens up the wood pores and also allowed the whiskey or the spirit inside to access it. Now, they didn't really know any of this, they just wanted to make sure it wasn't going to smell of fish. But then they would put it on barges down the Mississippi River. And these were more or less unpowered barges that would slowly go down the Mississippi River and get all the way down to New Orleans, which is quite the party city back in the day and still is now. Once it got down there, they opened these barrels. Oh, there's something wrong. The stuff's gone really colourful and brown. This can't be good, but we don't really want to waste it. We should have a drink of it. They taste it. It's like, oh, this is lovely. It's softened. It doesn't have as much bite anymore. So they started selling it that way. And they learned that the aging process of aging whiskey is super important. And that is why it doesn't matter where whiskey is made, there's always a denomination that has to be aged in wood. It doesn't necessarily have to be aged in oak in Australia, but it needs to be aged in there for a minimum of 2 years in Australia. In the States, it's 2 years. In Scotland and Ireland, it's 3 years. But it makes a big difference to whiskey and makes it very enjoyable. Now, I think I'm probably about time. Yeah. So I think just to sort of finish off, I'd just like to raise my glass in a great Scottish toast and say, Slàinte.
Have you got any questions?
Go ahead.
Marcus,
Yes.
how come the Japanese are starting to show the Scots up?
Well, it's interesting. And I mean, we talk about Rotary starting in 1923, did it? That's actually when the Yamazaki distillery opened as well. So it's 100 years of, just over 100 years of Japanese distilling. Initially when the Japanese distilled, they, and again I could talk about this for hours, but I've got to keep it short. Look, initially they wanted to make a very Scottish style of whiskey. In fact, the Shinjiro Tori started Yamazaki sent Masataka Takatsura over to Scotland to learn how to make whiskey. But they came back and economically they felt in slightly hard times and they were making pretty average stuff and it wasn't very good. They continued doing that until they started making proper whiskey again, and over the years they were just plodding along, mainly for the local market. And then there was about, in the early 2000s, some of the great whiskey writers started saying, you know, my top whiskey of the year is a Japanese whiskey. People go, Japanese whiskey, what's that? But then other people did the same, and it started winning awards. So there's a huge groundswell of desire for Japanese whiskey. Now, when you're a distiller, you've got to kind of try to forecast how much you need to make to look after your market. Now, Japanese whiskey hadn't been grown for years. In fact, we used to be able to get a bottle of something like Yamazaki 18-year-old here for about $150 to $180 a bottle. Now that same bottle costs me over $1,000 wholesale, right? So the Japanese, oh, this is great, and they're selling all their product. And then they get to the point, it's like, we're running out. We're losing our age statements. So supply and demand. Suddenly there's this enormous demand, and the supply is lacking, so they've just been able to increase their prices. And everyone thinks it's absolutely fantastic. Look, Japanese whiskey is good. It's good. I enjoy Japanese whiskey. But if I want value for money, I'm going to drink Irish and Scottish. And it's fantastic. Please.
Marcus, some years ago I read a book called The Whisky Trails,
Yes.
and in that book it advocated very strongly the use of water with the whisky to release some of the aroma, take a bit of the fire out. What's your view on water and whisky?
Look, normally when we do whisky events at Hains Co, we often do an event called Whisky 101, which is taking you through Irish, Scottish single malt, Scottish blend, Japanese, Australian and American. We do have little drippers of water on the tables as well. And it's a really good way to actually open up a whisky. Even a drop of whisky in your whisky glass changes the molecular breakup of that whisky in the glass and gives you much more access to the flavours and the notes as well in it. So a little bit of water is great, and it doesn't need to change the whisky, but even a couple of drops can be really good. Some whiskies, certainly at cask strength, can do it a little bit more. But it's in the eye of the beholder. However you like to drink it is okay. If I was drinking Johnny Walker, I think the only way is with Coke. I mean, really, Johnny Walker Red. Johnny Walker Red, let me just say. Look, Johnny Walker Black and everything, they're brilliant products. And Johnny Walker Green is one of my favourites, which is a pure malt, a blended malts. But their Johnny Walker Red is, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I didn't believe it was going to be that bad. I tasted some meat one day, so that's why you serve it with Coke.
What's your favourite?
Oh, there are so many favourites, really. It's like, how do you choose your favourite child? Look, I like a lot of whiskey. One of the things I didn't have the time to talk to is even Australian whiskey, which can be absolutely fantastic. And I think we're coming along in leaps and bounds in terms of how much better a product we're making than what we did in the early days. I have some favourite distilleries. I love Darlewin, which most people would never have heard of. It's actually part of Diageo. So Diageo own Johnny Walker, and they actually own more Scottish distilleries than anyone else, by far. They own so many of them. Now, Darlewin is not put in its own bottle. You can't go buy a bottle of Darlewin single malt. But I buy independent bottles. So these are people who go along to Darlewin and say, can I buy a cask of whiskey? And they'll bottle it independently with their information on it. And it took me years to find one I didn't like, which made it one of my favourite distilleries. But I also love Balvenie. I mean, the Balvenie distillery is something which is fantastic. And it's a distillery I've actually got to visit and to actually see everything they do. And very few distilleries do what they do. They still have a malting floor. They actually grow some of their own barley. They have their own cooperage. Cooperage is where they actually make the barrels, and they make all the barrels for Balvenie and Glenfiddich because they're all under the William Grant family.
Frank.
Oh, I was just going to make a comment. When my wife Margaret was introduced to my people in Ireland, my best school friend said, we have a real treat for you. And he produced 2 bottles of poachine in a brown paper bag that was brewed in the Spare Mountains, very similar to what you were talking about in Scotland. I grew up between Bushmills Distillery and the Sperrins, so I had access to both good whisky and bad whisky.
So poachine is an unaged Irish whisky. It's kind of like the white dog of the Irish whisky world, and it can be quite fantastic, but it's got a lot of flavour and bite. Yes, sir.
I was at strangely a Rotary International golf event at St Andrews some years ago. They can probably hear me anyway.
Oh, we can hear fine.
And a couple of the international Scottish people who I was with, who we played at a particular course, not St Andrews, but it was one of the courses that this gentleman was a friend of the Motteram family, and he was the captain of the club. And we went to play a round of golf, and there was a hole we had to hit up the hill, which is typical of Scotland. And we hit one of the friends, Robbie, who was one of the players, hit the ball, and everybody on the next tee cheered, and it went in the hole. Hole in one.
Wow.
And the tradition in Scotland in that private club was that you buy a very good bottle of Scotch whisky, put it on the bar, and everybody who's in the fore has 2 drams, drinks, and the rest is left for the rest of the population to come along and avail themselves of. But it was a Glenfarclas.
Oh, yes.
And that reminded me of the managing director I took over from in Melbourne, in David Jones once, who said there's only one Scottish whisky to drink, Glenfarclas.
Well, Glenfarclas is a good whisky too, and they often will do sherried whiskies. In fact, it's a wonderful Adelaide family that bring Glenfarclas over to Australia, and that's the St Agnes family, the Angos. In fact, I had a meeting with them just the other day because it's actually this year is 100 years of St Agnes brandy, and they're doing a lot of celebrations around that. And they've just released a 50-year-old, but they've got some fantastic product, and it's really well worth having a look at.
Thank you, Marcus, very much for your presentation today, and please accept our Rotary banners. Ladies and gentlemen, please take notice.